very much for having me along today. I'm going to talk to you for about 15 minutes. I'm just going to put a clock on so I know that I'm roughly 15. So bear with me. Okay. So how many of you work in open source? Oh, quite a few. Good. How many of you contribute to open source? A bit more, actually, not just the same people. And how many of you use open source? Some of you are lying to me because you all do. You may not know it. I'm Amanda Brock. I'm the CEO of OpenUK, and we are an industry organisation that's 6 years old. I'm going to tell you a little bit about me, about OpenUK and the work we do. And then I'm going to talk to you about AI and openness. And in particular, the last couple of years, it's been very full on. And then I'm going to talk to you a bit about policy and where that's going in the UK and Europe and on a global landscape. So OpenUK, 6 years old. We set it up as a consequence of Brexit. And when I was first approached about setting up a UK organisation for open source, I wasn't interested. We're a global community. We collaborate across borders. We have worked very closely with colleagues in the EU for many, many years on policy and various collaborations. And then we realised in the run-up to Brexit that we were no longer welcome in Europe, in the EU. So we needed to do something to coalesce and convene the UK's open tech community and to look at policy here in the UK. So we started to build OpenUK, and initially we were going to use a traditional business model where we brought companies into an industry body, and that's what you would expect us to do. And we very quickly realised that for open source that was wrong. And it was wrong because many of the people who work in open source here in the UK work for international organisations, work for entities in other jurisdictions, and we would have had quite a lonely little organisation if we were just looking at the UK companies. So we recognise that our community is a global community, it works globally, and actually I started to call it a submarine under the digital economy, and I often use this image of a yellow submarine, you know, the Beatles, very associated with the UK. And in that submarine today, if we look at the standard measures of open source community, things like GitHub accounts, when we look at GitHub accounts, there are 5.1 million in the UK. Now, there's like 14, 20 million in India and America. But when you take our 5.1 million collaborative accounts, people with those accounts, and you convert that into a per capita number, it's 7.9% of the UK population. And that's actually higher than any country in the world. So we have this ecosystem here in the UK that is globally collaborative. And we go into, if you look at our reporting, you'll see that we go into much more granular detail on, you know, people who make 1,000 commits or new contributors. And we track this every 3 months. And we know where across the UK those people are. So we have a really good idea about who this business community is, who's doing what, and the scope of it. And the scope of it isn't just software. Increasingly, it's AI. And that is made up of software, hardware, data, standards. So we bring all of those and the people doing that stuff together, irrespective of where their employers are. And we then take that and give it a policy voice. Now, my background is that I was a lawyer, and I was a lawyer for 25 years, mainly in tech companies or companies doing tech work. And in 2008, I joined a company called Canonical, which is the commercial sponsor of the Ubuntu operating system. I was their first lawyer. I was employee 165. And I was really going through that startup into scale-up process with them. And we were the cool kids on the block back then. So I was very lucky to meet a lot of young people who were part of the Ubuntu community and today run tech companies out of the Bay Area. So I know through that connection 18 years ago, just the most incredible group of people, and it's been a real privilege. And as time's gone by, I've increasingly got to know that UK community, and what I've been surprised by is people who are from the UK, who I thought were in the Bay Area, are actually still here. And we have this really dense, rich community in our submarine who do that deep tech, and I'm sure many of you are part of this. They do that deep tech work, they build our infrastructure that sits under a digital economy, and they're going to build our AI infrastructure as time goes by as well. So I've asked about which of you or who of you are in open source. Who would like to tell me what open source is? I'm always surprised by the flurry of hands of people wanting to volunteer a definition. Okay, I won't pick on anybody. So the simplest legal definition of open source is that you have code where the source is made available under an open source license. And an open source license is one that complies with something called the open source definition. And the open source definition has 10 points. It's about 30 years old, and nobody in open source knows what it says. It's a very badly kept secret. When I use slides, I'll have 3 slides going through what that definition is. The 2 key points in that definition, and if you take nothing else away from what you hear from me today, take this away. Anyone can use it for any purpose. Now, it's not like Creative Commons, which is for documentation, not for code, where you can have a non-commercial usage, right? Anyone can use it for any purpose. There is no restriction of use cases, and there is no restriction of people or people in geographies or personal characteristics or commercialization within that true definition. And that's where when we hear the term open washing, things go wrong. And things go wrong because somebody will say, I've got open source, or I'm giving you open source, and there will be a restriction. And it's really problematic because open source's success is fundamentally based on the ability to use, recycle, reuse, and share. And the fact that we can all rely on that trust cascade of technology. And that applies however the term open source is used. Anyone can use it for any purpose. Now, just a quick caveat, law trumps licensing. So that anyone can use it for any purpose is subject to legal rules. You can't use it to murder somebody, for example. That's pretty much universal. So keep that in your head as I start to talk to you about AI. Now, you're mostly quite young, but for me, AI feels like doggy years. You know, seven dog years and 1 human year. And the last 3 years has just been exponential in what's happened. And it all started in March 23 with ChatGPT-4. And suddenly I have a sort of grapevine of people telling me things that is when, you know, new technology comes out. And suddenly everybody was getting excited about GPT-4. This can really do what I need day to day, you know, and the buzz around that initially was incredible. But it was a close, despite the company's name, OpenAI, very misleading, originally set up to be open source and then shifted away to proprietary and closed. It very quickly became apparent that that closed nature was stopping innovation. Llama was released in March, and Llama had an academic license with a restriction that it could only be used for academic purposes, so not open source. And somehow it was leaked. How you leak an LLM remains to be seen, but somehow it was leaked. And the open source community got their hands on it, and they got their hands on a piece that was missing. They did not have the financial wherewithal to that point in time to create a $100 million piece of technology, which is what a large language model at the time was. And as soon as they got access to it, the pace of innovation in the open was incredible. So by May of that year, there was a leaked memo from Google. Now, I'll give you the caveat that it was from one employee, but the headline on it, come in, don't worry, it's fine, come in and sit down, you're fine. So the headline on it was, we have no moat. And what they meant is our big tech castle has a moat around it, and that moat protects us and allows us to sell our products. And that moat is usually intellectual property and the fact that we can differentiate our innovation from the free stuff. And they could not do so. They could not differentiate themselves because of the pace of innovation in those few short months. And it really brought to light the value of open collaboration, not just that it enables new innovation, that it allows new entrants to the market, but just the pace of many eyes, many hands on that technology. So we fast forward to July of that year, and OpenUK actually worked with Meta on the release of Llama 2 as open innovation. Now, you probably haven't heard that term. Until it was launched, Meta described it universally as open innovation. And they did that. They didn't call it open source for 2 reasons, I suppose. One is we weren't talking about the data, so we're only looking at the model. So now we would probably call that an open model, or even an open weight, I suppose. But really, the reason it wasn't called open source was that the license doesn't meet the open source definition. The license has an acceptable use policy, so it restricts how you can use it. And as a non-commercialization term, you can commercialize it up to 7 million users. And after that, 7 million, you double check that because I get that number wrong sometimes. But after that, you have to go back to Meta and get a commercial license. And that's hugely misunderstood. You know, if your procurement process says, is it open source? They say yes, tick, and you're not checking licenses. You're bringing something into your organization that actually has commercial implications and IP implications that you don't expect. So we then move forward to January 2025, and we see the launch of DeepSeek's R1 in China. Now, DeepSeek distilled existing technology, including Llama. So we think, despite the arguments over Meta using the term open source for Llama prior to that, that we made the right decision as an organization in supporting that opening up. We thought it was really important, and we still think it's important. You know, if I was to write the history of AI on my deathbed, I suspect that I will write the opening up of Llama as one of the critical moments in time. And the next one for me will be DeepSeek releasing R1. And that the criticality of that wasn't just the technology innovation, but that it reduced the cost from 100 to 5 million. And that's incredible. It's a 20th of the cost of the pre-existing AI models. And what's really interesting for me about that is the way that the Chinese develop. So I was in Beijing December. I got to speak to DeepSeek and others, and the one thing I took away from it was compute. As they develop and design, they are absolutely focused on building the leanest technology because they have less access to compute. And that's really going to matter as time goes by and we look at the global south and opening up innovation, making it available for everyone. So we move forward and we get to this year, or the end of last year. We have MCP, Model Context Protocol, an open protocol. Anyone know where it was created? London. By an Austrian and I think a Spaniard who worked for Anthropic. It was put at the end of last year into the Agentic AI Foundation to make sure that it will be open forever and open and available for everybody to use. This year, OpenClaw, anyone know where that was created? London, by an Austrian who's now working for OpenAI but still in London, and it's going into its own foundation. So we see these massive innovations, and if you speak to Peter Steinberger, who created OpenClaw, he will tell you he created it in between jobs. He was doing some open source stuff, he was hacking around, and he was thinking about what he wanted to do. I told a story last night about one of my oldest friends who's an engineer, and I asked her why she does open source, and she said, because my managers are bad. And I said, okay, what does that mean? She said, well, I go to work, they make me do X, Y, Z. But in reality, we need ABC. So when I'm at home, I build ABC. Everybody needs ABC, so I share it. People contribute back, and suddenly we've got a technology that's universally adopted. And that's the beauty of opening things up from an academic, from a research, from an innovation perspective. Sitting on the other side of the fence, if you are an end user or a government, what you want is your people to have access to technology without barriers of lock-in and cost. Now, it depends on how you do it, but done well, done right, openness can allow you that. So it is absolutely critical for a future, which brings me to policy. The UK took some leadership, and a couple of years ago we saw a summit at Bletchley Park with 100 world leaders. They had mainly prime ministers, Elon Musk, etc. were there. I knew two people who were at it. It was impossible to get into. And the words open source were muttered twice, once by the French, once by the Chinese, which pretty much reflects those nation states' approach to openness. They are the driving forces today. We sadly are not where we should be. Fast forward 18 months to Paris, to the French AI Action Summit. I'm the first person in an open source community who's been allowed to go to one of those summits. And I think that's atrocious. But I got to go. And we saw some launches there around openness. So we saw Roost, which is R-O-O-S-T. It's a set of tools, and the tools are all open source software which will help in your AI. It will help you to build the governance that you need. And I expect that as time goes by and we see more and more globalization in governance and compliance, that you will use more and more of these tools rather than having prescriptive laws. So Roost at the Paris Summit was quite a big deal. You go forward a year, and then we have the India AI Impact Summit, which I also went to. And typical of India, I think we've possibly got one or two people from there in the room. Typical of India, it was big. There was a trade exhibition. It was totally different from the 100 people in Bletchley. But open source was all over it. And we worked a lot with the open source community in the year before, using the lessons we'd learned from Paris to make sure their voice was at least audible, if not heard, different things. However, when the summit statement came out, there was a reference to open source for the first time. So on a policy level, at a global level, we are making progress. There's a UN event at AI for Good in July where I think open source will also be part of that global governance agenda. Somewhat disappointingly, and if I'm really honest with you, on the way here, I was thinking about writing. I've got to write an article for the press today, and I'm wondering if I start it with "I've failed." And we all fail sometimes, it's fine. I've spent 6 years trying to persuade the UK government to do the right thing around open source, and yesterday we saw, for our London Tech Week, announcements about open source for the first time, open source and AI. Now, some of you may be interested because there is a 1-week application space for a dev board for anybody who's an AI dev to apply. You have to be under 30, so who knows how much experience or knowledge you will have. But 10 people are going to be selected who will have direct access to the AI minister and meet him 3 times as part of a consultation on AI and openness. And they announced that, and they announced 500,000 of credits for compute access for open source. But I think that was available free in January anyway, if they hadn't changed the rules. Last week in the EU, in happier news, they announced 2 billion euros of investment into open source. And even there, the community is nervous about the how. You can make open source policies, you can make open source laws, but they won't achieve your end goal unless you have the system behind it, unless you have the practical processes and the infrastructure. So we have, and to date failed, been campaigning to have a national foundation and that structure built. But we do have other routes in, so don't feel too sorry for me. I'm just smarting from the announcements yesterday not being substantial. We are working with UKRI and others, partly to become an independent research organisation and partly to build that infrastructure. So I'm pretty much at my 15 minutes. I don't know if I'm allowed questions. Are you good?
It's so exciting that I think I will allow some questions.
Okay.
Yeah, Nicola, please. Yeah,
stop my timer.
It's so relevant to us. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Good.
I think in just shorten his introduction down to 2 minutes. Any questions?
A silent room, was it too much? There we go.
How do you rationalise the fact that etc. were training?
How do I rationalise the fact that,
Llama and etc.
Yeah.
Open weights models?
copyright?
Yes.
Okay. I find this super interesting. So the UK has failed to make a decision through 2 governments and something like 3 or 4 rounds of consultations on whether text and data mining is legal in the UK. Told you I used to be an IP/IT lawyer in the tech sector, and we have a thing called a transient copy that we were always able to create. And there's one school of thought that says you can have a transient copy for the use of technology without actually breaching copyright. And that's the basis on which the training is being done. Currently, nobody trains in the UK, and I think that's detrimental to the UK because there is a lack of clarity. So those who apply the old school law say that we have TDM here, but there have been doubts cast on that, and annoyingly, it has been portrayed as the creative sector versus tech. And actually, researchers, academic outputs, and code are all in the same place as the creative content. So my view on this is slightly controversial, and I co-authored a report with the Tony Blair Institute about 18 months ago. So copyright for me isn't fit for purpose. And it's not just not fit for purpose because of the legal structure. The reality of our society is that if you are a creative producing a movie, you're going to be selling it to Netflix and Amazon, and they take the copyright off you anyway. So I think it's a red herring that we're wasting a lot of energy around. And meanwhile, we're failing to have language models trained on UK data. And I would rather the spelt colour with a U personally. You know, there's that, I would rather our culture was part of it. So I think it is a really difficult question. People get very, very emotive about it. And what they're getting emotive about isn't so much copyright, if you really look at the underlying driver. They're getting emotive because content creators are going to need to be paid in the future if we want human-generated content. And we need to find a new model for recompensing and rewarding those individuals. And the same thing applies to the open source community. You know, we rely on the gift that these people have given us of this fantastic code that is part of our infrastructure that didn't cost us anything. We then treat maintainers as if they have an SLA without paying them. And we burn them out. You know, we don't give them the support they need. So that's going to have to shift. In Europe, the Cyber Resilience Act, if you then monetize anything that you have created, even if you're only selling support or services around it, you have to meet the extra layers of cyber resilience and have liability. You know, when you give something away free and you disclaim it, that's pretty hard. So it's a long way of answering it. And I know it's very controversial. I think failing to make a decision, which two governments now have multiple times, is hugely problematic. And I don't know, do you all know what Stargate is? So when Trump visited us last September, OpenAI were with them and they pledged so much money to the UK for data centres through a company called Nscale. Nscale's VP of Engineering is a very close friend, one of my ambassadors, and is building Nscale as a hyperscaler in the UK using OpenStack. So it's all built on open source. But OpenAI had come with Trump and they'd pledged all this money and they withdrew it in March. And they withdrew it on the basis that energy in the UK is too expensive. It was going to go into data centres, which we obviously need. And then the second reason was that they can't train because of that uncertainty around copyright. They said regulatory issues. So whether it's right or not, you know, whether that's disingenuous or not, we gave them an excuse which we shouldn't have. So that was a very long answer to a short question, sorry.
Any other questions?
Be careful what you ask, I could be here all day.
Thank you so much. This is really an important topic that I'm really happy that we're starting with this. One quick question I had is, as you look to the future, where are you most excited about opportunities where you can have open weight models? Mm-hmm. One thing that's really remarkable about the computer science community at large is that you have a culture of being open.
Yeah.
I come from the biotech community, which is closed by default.
Yeah.
But what is the future? Will we continue to rely on these massive companies for open weights?
That's actually quite a complicated question. So some of this is about the technology, some of it is about the legal structure, and some of it is about the economic reality of 8 companies owning our AI today and geopolitics. So if you look at China, China has had an 8-year to-date strategy. Started by building their own foundation. I didn't get my ideas from nowhere, but they built a national foundation which enabled the structuring behind what was being done. The last strategy from there in the end of October, 31st October, says they're going to stop doing as many iterations of things. They're going to streamline and they're going to monetize it better. So they're moving from that. You start by getting adoption. You make it open source, people ignore it. You know how to build community, you know how to build consensus, you know how to bring people around you, you get contribution, you build it out, it becomes a de facto standard, and then hopefully you've worked it out already, but then you start to implement your monetization. You know, that's how it works. Hopefully you do that in a way that is also good for society. We have this problem where, and I sort of think of myself as partly responsible for this because I worked in the dot-com boom. I went into companies in 1999 and, worked through that. And it wasn't obvious what was happening initially. And then when it was obvious to those of us in tech, it wasn't understood by governments. And we allowed these massive corporations to evolve and to hold all of the IP and to hold the technologies. And open source is the darling of those big techs. They all use it. And I think what we have is sort of different kinds of open source. So you have open source, which is made up of community contribution and grows. You have people using open source to build adoption, to build a business. And then you have this sort of corporate collaboration. Linux Foundation is at the heart of that. and you bring together entities, you have to have enough big companies that will fund it. And what you do is you build a ubiquitous stack and then differentiate yourself at the top of that stack. And that bit that can be ubiquitous, you save money on, you build better innovation, and you make sure that you have many eyes on it. So, you know, things like bugs and problems. You've all seen Mythos recently, and the fact that it's been trained on so much data, it can go straight for the vulnerabilities in code bases. It knows what they are. And collectively, Glasswing is the response to that, where many companies have been given a pre-access to try and strengthen the infrastructure and make sure that it won't be attacked as time goes by. And AI is going to be a real problem for open source in that way. It's also a problem for proprietary code bases in the same way. So where is it all going? It's almost guaranteed that open will win. I'm going to name drop now. I met Jan LeCun earlier this year, and he and I had a conversation about the success of open source. And he was saying that he thought it was because it technically wasn't good enough, that we didn't have enough adoption of AI at the moment. And I don't agree with him. So I worked in open source software when the technology was good enough, but it wasn't adopted. And the AI is good enough, but not adopted at as much of a scale here as it is some places or ought to be. And part of the reason is risk, right? There's this phrase, nobody ever got sacked for hiring Big Blue, IBM. If you are a risk professional, a lawyer, a procurement person, a finance person, and you're being asked to sign off, you're signing off risk. So you're thinking about it, and if you don't understand something, you cannot assess the risk. And if you don't understand the openness, you cannot assess the risk. And they were the blocker to open source software being adopted at scale. I mean, we had this sort of GitHub moment where not only did we have the platform economy where everything was built in open source, we had digitalization where every company was using those platforms and therefore shifting to open source. What I said to you all at the beginning about are you using it, and some of you thought you weren't when you are. And then you also had GitHub. And what GitHub did was enable the engineers to go and take the software, take it straight into their environment, whether it was academic or a company, bypass the risk professionals, use it, and only go to the risk professionals when they needed money. So you'd go when you now needed a support agreement and it was embedded into your company. There will be an equivalent moment in AI. If I knew what it was, I'd be making a lot of money. I don't know what it will be. I could guess. And I'm watching people as they're trying to build those kind of structures around things like MCP to try and make that happen. I have no doubt that we will end up with openness. It's not just the term. So I did some press quotes last night on the statements in London Tech Week. And open source isn't a magic word, is a phrase that I used there. There is a sort of recipe that goes with it to make that success happen. And that's what we have to build to enable it. But it will happen because ultimately you will see the middle nations start to collaborate more. China's already going down that open source route with things like Kimi. Do you all know Kimi? So Kimi is definitely the model of choice for developers in China. If you don't know it, you should have a look. It's sort of inevitable, but I think it will probably take a period of time. In the same ways, we're not all going to lose our jobs tomorrow, right? The AI isn't sophisticated enough. It's not refined enough. The other thing that I'm seeing a lot of is sectors. So the mobile sector, for example, is training models. They've assessed the models on how good they are for the mobile sector. And now they're training them specifically on generic, publicly available data, and they're training them on confidential data. So they're doing that, behind closed doors. So you will get very focused models, seeing more small models, small language models. And the thing that I like best that I've heard about this year is they're teaching models, and you may already all know this, but they're teaching models to abstain from answering. So it's not about hallucination, it's about not answering what you don't know. So we're not going to lose our jobs because it's not there yet. But also we don't have that infrastructure. We don't have the right data centers and networks that we need for AI at scale. And that's all going to take a bit of time. If I was to bet, I would say that we will end up with the mobile phone being where we do most of our processing as individuals, maybe your desktop at home, because those are the models that we've been trained to do. We know how to pay a monthly subscription, and that will also move the processing away from data centres, so we'll need less of these big data centres that the UK is struggling with. Okay?
Thank you. I'm going to have to...
Yeah, call time.
Live.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. It has been
Thank you very much.
fascinating.